Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. It looks like we still have a few people joining us, so we'll get started in just a couple of minutes. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jessica Stenclift, and I am the Director of Marketing at Accudata Systems. Thank you for joining us today, and welcome to our PCI QSA Open Forum webinar. Before we get started this morning, just a couple of housekeeping items I'd like to cover. First, because this is a live Q&A, please feel free to start asking your questions immediately in the chat window in your browser. We did receive 3 questions during the registration process, so we'll address those first and then open up the floor. If we're unable to get to your questions today, our QSAs will be emailing you individually to answer your questions. Please allow 48 to 72 hours for those responses. After the webinar, each attendee will receive a post-event email with both our recorded webinar and a copy of the slides. Today, we're joined by 2 extremely knowledgeable experts who are here to help address your toughest challenges around maintaining PCI compliance. I'd like to welcome our 2 QSAs. First, Anton Abaya. Anton is a risk and compliance consultant at Accudata Systems and has more than 14 years of experience in IT security audit, compliance, operations, and consulting. Anton has performed numerous services for many public and private organizations in aerospace and research, banking and finance, healthcare, higher education, retail, and technology, ranging from Fortune 1000 firms to Fortune 50. We're also pleased to welcome Ismail Afaro. Ismail is a Risk and Compliance Professional Services Manager and Solutions Architect at Accudata. Ismail oversees all aspects of service delivery and customer satisfaction for our Risk and Compliance team. Before joining Accudata, he spent 8 years building and maturing a security program for a Fortune 300 retailer, and he brings more than 15 years of security experience to our Accudata Risk and Compliance team. He has worked on projects to meet HIPAA and PCI compliance, performed technical assessments, and advised clients on how to increase their information security programs and reduce risk to critical systems and data. So with that background, thank you again for joining us. Let's go ahead and get started with our first question. We'll try to keep it to 30 minutes. And as I said, if we don't get to your question, we'll get that answered within the next 2 to 3 business days. So our first question is going to go to Ismail. How do you manage vendors and contractors when it comes to PCI compliance?
Thanks, Jessica, and welcome to everybody joining the call today. We appreciate your participation. So vendor management, service provider management. This is one that really can trip up merchants when they're dealing with their compliance program. There's not really a defined process in place. We've seen where we can get through the majority of an assessment and really have some serious delays when we get to the requirements for service provider and contractor vendor management. So it really kind of boils down to you got to have a defined process. Just like your technology side of the house and policy creation, all those things that you're dealing with from a administrative or a technical control, this administrative control has to have a defined process. If you have something in place when you're working with your legal team before your contract gets signed, that's the best place to begin. Just make sure that it is baked in from the very beginning of the contract process. Make sure that really the requirements for what the service provider is going to be responsible for your compliance program is defined right up front in a written agreement, and that it's addressed in the contract, and as well as the ongoing documentation for that vendor. For where we see we get ourselves in the most trouble is where something like that didn't take place and service provider relationships were entered into kind of after the fact, and so we kind of have to kind of work backwards. So we have to go through a process of discovery, who are our service providers, what kind of relationship they have with us, what are they doing for us in regards to cardholder data processing, how are they accessing the networks, things like that. And then we have to just kind of work backwards into baking all that in, getting all the written contracts. And that can be a very time-consuming and difficult process, especially for organizations that are very large and complex and have relationships with a lot of service providers. I have a healthcare hospital system who has literally thousands of service providers and business associates, and having to work backwards to determine which of those can impact the security of the cardholder data environment or has a direct function with the CDE could be a really, really big nightmare if we had to go through that exercise working our way backwards. So get it up front, get it into the contract, and make sure that you're performing your due diligence and following up on that on an annual basis. So it's just another program to add to your compliance program.
Great. Thank you, Ismail. Is there anything you'd like to add, Anton?
Sure. And again, welcome, everyone. Thanks for your participation as well. Ismail, you answered the question spot on. I think the one thing I would add is that, be prepared as you're looking through your existing service providers that some service providers may not have PCI compliance, very well put together yet, in which case you might need to really kind of, arm wrestle them into compliance, maybe threaten to replace them with a different service provider. I've seen clients successfully do that and get their service provider PCI compliant in a short amount of time. There are some that are, PCI compliant already, but won't provide you certain type of paperwork without muscling them to give you that paperwork. Sometimes you have to engage your acquiring bank or even Visa, bring them to the call with your service provider. Hopefully it doesn't come to that, but we have seen that happen, and sometimes that's what you need to do. The last point I'll add to that is there is also a really good PCI guidance document on vendor due diligence. It's a document called PCI Third Party Security Assurance. You can Google that one, PCI Third Party Security Assurance, and it was a guidance document directly from the PCI Council on how to build your vendor due diligence program.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great.
Fantastic. Thank you both. All right, we're going to go ahead and move on to our second question then. So this one is directed toward Anton first. Once your company receives the P2PE certification, is the QSA required to perform a preliminary review or assessment to confirm that the area covered by P2PE is no longer in scope for PCI?
That's a great question. So I think we need to clear a few things up. Let's try to clear a few things up here first. So the entire point of P2PE is to simplify things for PCI because of how secure that technology is. Now, when a merchant or service provider entity typically, they typically do not need P2PE certification, or more accurately said, P2PE validation. This validation is more for P2PE solution vendors or providers that sell or offer these products. And the validation for that is performed by what's called a P2PE QSA, not a PCI QSA, which is what Ismail and I are. Now, if a merchant or service provider is seeking to reduce PCI scope through the deployment of P2PE technologies, they need to deploy what's called a listed P2PE validated solution. And by listed, what I mean with that is it needs to be listed on the PCI website. If you actually Google PCI P2PE validated solutions, you'll see that list. Now, if you deploy a listed validated P2PE solution, you don't need a P2PE QSA to kind of certify your installation. That's the entire point. If you deploy a listed solution, you don't have to go through that certification process. However, you still have obligations for PCI compliance, which means you might need to still engage a PCI QSA to validate your compliance if you're large enough, such as a level 2 or level 1 merchant. But since you've already massively reduced your PCI scope, the PCI QSA validation process will be a much smaller engagement. And we've had many customers in the past 2 years that have been able to find P2PE solutions on this list that worked very well in their environment, and it vastly reduced the PCI compliance obligations, scope, and assessment costs. Now, going back to the question, there are some very rare instances where you would need a P2PE QSA to kind of validate your solution, and these are usually what we would call hybrid merchant managed P2PE solutions. These are organizations that have the keys, the decryption keys to decrypt the cardholder data coming in from their P2PE devices. In these cases, it's obviously very highly recommended to engage a P2PE QSA to evaluate your unique setup. Now, if your environment cannot support one of the listed solutions on the PCI website, or maybe you've already deployed a P2PE solution that is not listed, and that's actually very common and we see it a lot, step one would be to engage your acquiring bank for their guidance. They will tell you if they have an opinion or not on that non-validated, non-listed P2PE solutions. In many cases, they might tell you to reach out to a QSA anyway, especially if you're large enough. Very close to number two is, very close to number one, step two, is ask your non-validated P2P solution provider for what's called a NESA document. NESA stands for Non-Validated Encryption Solution Assessment, or a similar document where a P2P QSA reviewed that solution, that non-listed P2P solution. In these documents, you will typically find or see defined by the P2P QSA what the PCI scope will be for your non-validated solution. Now, unfortunately, I've seen in these NESA documents where a P2P QSA pretty much said that a majority of the PCI requirements and workstations connected to your P2P devices are still all in scope of PCI. So it's very important to read this document, ideally before you buy.
Fantastic. Thanks, Anton. Anything that you would like to add, Ismail?
That was all great, and I agree with Anton 100%. I think going back to his point of making sure you're going with an approved solution, that even when you get that approved solution, make sure you're getting the implementation guide along with it. I think, Anton, if you might be able to chime in there, but having that implementation guide and looking through that helps the QSA just ensure everything's been installed correctly or configured and implemented correctly. For a validated solution, that could be an accompanying document even with a validated solution. So that's all I would chime in with that.
Fantastic, thank you guys. So we'll get on to the last question that was submitted during that registration process, and that question is, in terms of Type D SAQ, since every device is in scope, does this require a pen test for every site, or can sampling play a factor? And this one is going to Ismail.
Okay. Yeah, so there's a lot of moving parts, I would think, in this question here. So kind of reading into it, looks like we've got a merchant where they may have an environment that has to be validated against an SAQ Type D, and every device in that merchant's environment is in scope. So, do we have to pen test for every site, or can sampling play a factor? So So the CDE, if every device has to be in scope, then yes, you have to pen test the entire environment. You're going to want to do that just to make sure that the security of the CDE is intact. All your entry points won't lead to compromise your CDE. This is kind of, so I want to just make sure we're on the same page there. I guess to lead this off, to backtrack just a little bit, when I read every device in scope, my QSA kind of like alarm bells go off, and I guess I would kind of ask the question to the merchant, what type of isolation or scope reduction methodologies have we put in place? And that would be my first move. I wouldn't want to apply the entire SAQD to the entire environment of every single device. Achieving and maintaining compliance in that kind of environment can be very, very complex, very difficult. So we would advise to go through a scope reduction exercise, whether that means offloading some of our payment processing to, like through P2PE, as we talked about earlier, or through some kind of redirection to payment gateways, or through some type of network segmentation work. But we really want to reduce down that landscape of the CDE to just what truly is in scope. Now, okay, so maybe we can't do that for some business reason, or something is causing our entire environment to be in scope. And then the answer is yes. We have to consider the entire environment to be pen tested. So now, where we can talk about sampling is if we're going to pen test only a sampling, that is permitted. It's not permitted when you're doing vulnerability scans, but when you are doing a penetration test, sampling can be considered as long as it's a representative sampling of the cardholder data environment. It needs to include, of course, all of your entry and exit points to the CDE, your critical systems of the CDE, and your CDE segmentation mechanisms all need to be part of that pen test. But as long as if we have multiple sites and they're all configured the same way, they all use the same type of firewalling equipment, routers, workstations, whatever is part of that, and it is a representative sampling of everything, then a sampling can be pen tested. There is some guidance that was provided by the council, and the name of that document is PCI Penetration Testing Guidance, which can give you some additional background. So I hope that answers the question. Again, I would want to go back and really say reducing the scope is your goal, and then pen testing on that reduced scope. But if you can't, then I hope that my answer provided some guidance. Anton, do you have anything to add to that, or something I might not have been clear on?
Yeah, I think you covered it for the most part. I think one thing I would add, though, is that if you go down the path of representative sampling for a penetration test, right, and say you have 1,000 stores, and and it turns out that all 1,000 stores actually have different setups. Maybe you have 5 different point-of-sale applications in those 1,000 stores. So now you have a representative. You're going to need a representative sampling of that, and so your penetration tester is going to be testing a lot more, and that can be a fairly large engagement. They're going to be visiting a lot of stores or pen testing a lot of different stores. Mm-hmm. So if you get to a point where your representative sampling is actually very complex, because your environment is very complex, and your pen test becomes overly complex, large, or expensive, and will never be approved by management, for that matter, then go back to step 1, which is what Ismail kept talking about, which is try to reduce scope. Right, this is usually a good time to talk directly with a QSA to see what kind of scope reduction strategies might apply to your environment.
Great answer. Thank you for breaking that one down for everyone. So we're going to go ahead and open it up to the questions that are coming in from our attendees. The first question that we have is, what is the best method or matrix for doing risk management and building a risk management policy? And let's go ahead and have Anton start that one off.
Great. So what is the best method or matrix for doing a risk management and building risk management policies? So first off, let me say that there is a PCI guidance document on risk assessments and how to perform these. In terms of a matrix of things to look for when you're performing a risk assessment, when we say matrix, I'm thinking of a matrix of vulnerabilities, of threats, typical risks that would affect a cardholder data environment. There are several best practice methodologies out there from NIST, from Octave. All of these are actually referenced in the PCI DSS, where you could start if you want a framework to start with. Now, Accudata performs risk assessments for customers, and we always start our assessments with a very clear data discovery or sensitive data discovery process. Now, we follow this approach, whether be it PCI or HIPAA when it comes to EPHI. But when it comes to PCI, we really need a really good understanding of where all cardholder data is stored, processed, or transmitted. From there, we can then start applying, the matrix of threats and vulnerabilities. Again, kind of a database of that, and approaching it from that perspective. Sometimes it feels like you're doing a PCI assessment, but really you got to kind of shift your mind away from the PCI requirements themselves and more think about it from the threats that are coming in from all sorts of different directions against your environment. Really, you're focusing on the risk landscape and asking questions about how can your environment survive a potential attack, potential threat source, right? And from there, you start documenting what controls you have in place that would address that. Now, some of those controls could be the PCI requirements themselves that you've already met, but sometimes it might not be that, right? You might realize, hey, even though we're PCI compliant, there's this new threat that has come, right? Where there is say malware scraping, memory scraping malware that's capturing credit card numbers in memory, right? There's no PCI requirement that directly addresses that risk. There's lots that will prevent that from coming onto the workstation in particular, but then your risk management response could be that, well, the best technology to deploy to thwart that threat is point-to-point encryption technology, which removes cardholder data from ever going into these workstations that could be affected by malware scraping RAM. So, again, to answer the question, start with those best practice guidance documents that are out there already and build from that and customize it to your environment.
Thank you, Anton. We're going to go ahead and move on to our next question. This one's for Ismail. Do you have any recommendations for organizations that are looking to fully outsource card payments and processing to third-party service providers?
Okay, great. Before I go to that, let me jump back to the risk management policy really just very quickly, because I see that as a really, and Anton, I agree with everything you said there. Just to add something there, this is a really good place, going back to the question about service provider and vendor management. Include that in your risk management approach. The service provider list and the risk that they bring to your organization, that's a really great place to include service provider management as within your annual risk management program. So I just wanted to add that to that answer. Now, going to this one, could you go ahead and repeat that question for me again, please?
Absolutely. Do you have any recommendations for organizations looking to fully outsource card payments and processing to third-party service providers?
Gotcha. Oh, okay. Great question. So this goes back to our discussion of scope reduction kind of methodologies and how we can reduce scope. We've talked about a few of those already, and we've talked about point-to-point encryption quite a bit on today's call. That is a great place where you can deploy these types of devices and really reduce your compliance burden and the overall cardholder data flow. Encryption keys are managed by the gateway provider or your acquiring bank. Again, that's just a great way to engage that service provider for scope reduction, so point-to-point encryption. The next place is where really specific to e-commerce environments. So in an e-commerce environment, we were going to I want to talk about redirection. So there's a technology to basically, instead of taking credit card payment on my web application and I'm taking the card, I'm taking the CVV and the expiration and all that information that all the bad guys want and causes my compliance effort to grow exponentially, what I'm going to do is redirect that payment page to a approved third-party payment gateway. You want to, approve just because that's the account, you want to make sure that it's part of the council's approved gateway solution. And so now my customer is entering all that information on somebody else's website. You might hear iframe redirection as part of the idea here, but that's really what we're trying to do. Is we're taking customer payment information off of our payment application forms and onto a third-party gateway. Those would be the two recommendations I would make to leverage the most. Iframes for e-commerce, point-to-point encryption internally, and getting devices like that installed to reduce my scope, and leveraging those service providers that way.
Thank you. Anything you'd like to add, Anton?
Sure, real quick. Ismail covered the main points there. Iframes, redirects are great ways to reduce scope for e-commerce type of use cases. P2P also very effective for reducing card present transaction PCI scope. It's important to understand that the more you outsource, the more PCI goes away. Which is why a lot of organizations find it very attractive. But just know that that PCI compliance never reaches absolute zero, right? You still will have some PCI obligations, but the more you outsource, the more it goes away. And sometimes outsourcing can also have its own costs, such as per transaction, right? Because the service provider may charge you more per transaction. You would also have a lack of control over the process or the look and feel. Right? And some organizations are afraid that if you work with a service provider, outsource everything, that your data or your business is kind of, in double quotes here, held hostage by the service provider. But these risks can be mitigated, of course. Having said that, we've seen customers certainly do this very successfully. And what used to be a big annual PCI expense, and headache for that matter, became much easier. One more thing I'll mention is that you also want to take a look at the Visa service provider list to see if the vendors you're looking at are already listed on the Visa list. It's a list by Visa of service providers that have achieved PCI compliance. Seeing them on that list is obviously a good thing. And also ask your acquirer for guidance. They might have service provider relationships already, or they may even offer that service themselves. See that especially with some of the larger acquirers.
Thank you very much. Great information. So we are almost up on the hour, so we've got time for one more question here. And the question is going to be directed toward Ismail first. Anton, also feel free to weigh in. We've got, so when creating firewall standards, does every firewall rule set have to be identified, noted, and authorized in documentation? What about for customized configuration of those firewalls? And then how detailed does that documentation need to be?
Okay, great question. So your firewall standards, this going down to the requirement one, requirements related to business justification of firewall rules protecting the card data environment. So I think we need to consider that those requirements apply to the CDE environment. So anything allowing access into my CDE or allowing access out, your QSA is going to need to look at that documentation and examine it to make sure that the port services protocols are addressed, make sure that they're authorized and justified, Of course, that you're not going to be wanting to use any kind of insecure kind of protocol like Telnet or FTP or anything like that going in and out of your CDE. And if you are, then you be prepared to provide additional documentation and reasoning for why that's in place. The documentation itself, so if we have a firewall and it's providing access in and out, that firewall may be actually providing access to other areas of the network as well. But what we are concerned with as QSAs is the CDE. What's going in, what's coming out, and is it defined and is it justified? So when we talk about how defined or how mature this documentation needs to be, it really needs to answer those questions. What area of the network is my CDE? Where's this firewall? What is this firewall allowing in? So if you take a look at it and think of a firewall access control list rule, you can get it down to that granular if you want to in your documentation. And I've seen that provided in a spreadsheet kind of format with another column that kind of just outlines what the business justification is, and another column that maybe represents the owner of the device and management sign-off. And so all the rules that relate to the inbound access to the CDE are represented in this document. All the rules that are allowing access out by this firewall are represented in this document, and justification for each of those rules is provided. So it can get very cumbersome, but it does need to get down to that level of granularity so that your QSA can take a look at it. Now, keep in mind that not only your QSA is going to look at that documentation to make sure it's there and represented, but a running configuration of the firewall is also going to need to be provided as well, so that we can actually see that the running configuration represents what your documentation that you presented. It's all in line there. So I hope that answers the question. Anton, do you have any tips, tricks, hacks for a document like this for customers that you have engaged with, what it looks like, what it contains?
We actually have templates that we usually provide to customers and who are looking to craft something like this. What I'll add to what you said is definitely you have to meet the PCI requirements in Section 1 related to firewalls, and that will detail how much documentation you need minimally. Now, the more complex your environment is, the more people who access these firewalls, the more firewalls you have protecting your CDEs, the more complex your document will be, right? But if it's a very simple, you have one firewall protecting e-commerce, and only a few people, 2 firewall admins, right? Then your documentation would be much, much simpler, but it just still needs to at least minimally meet the PCI requirements. So again, look through the Section 1 requirements in PCI.
Thank you both. All right, well, we are at the top of the hour, so at this point, we're going to be concluding the webinar. If you did have a question today that wasn't answered, our apologies. We will certainly get back to you within the next 72 hours at a maximum. If you think of additional questions that maybe were spurred by the discussion today, feel free to either reach out to your account manager and they can get you in contact with our QSA team, or you are welcome to respond to the post-event email that each of you will receive this afternoon with the recorded webinar. So if you were trying to take frantic notes during the webinar, don't worry, you'll be getting this recording later today. We appreciate you all joining us and hope you have a great afternoon. Thank you so much.